Everyone, we will start in just a minute. I see more people are joining. Welcome everyone who just joined. We will start in just a minute to give an opportunity to everyone to join. I think we have a pretty good number to start. Hi everyone, I'm Vesa Vunici. I'm the International Relations Specialist at the FDA Latin America office. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome everyone to this webinar, the implementation of good regulatory practices and pharmaceutical regulations in the Americas. This webinar is dedicated to good regulatory practices. Through forums like this, we're able to share information, experiences, and expertise that facilitate development of regulatory systems that are consistent and globally aligned, minimizing unnecessary burdens while promoting effective and efficient processes. We appreciate the opportunity to provide this webinar in collaboration with FIFARMA and our ANVISA and FDA colleagues. We have some great expertise here today, and so we encourage everyone to use the time that we have for questions and answers to ask your questions. After each presentation, we have some time for question and answers. I would say you don't have to wait for that particular time to put in the questions in the question and answer box. So there's a specific menu where you can put your questions as the presentations are going on. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that there's interpretation available for today's webinar, and so you should see a globe in Zoom, and please select your language of preference to be able to hear in that particular language. With that, I think we're ready to get started. First, our first topic on the agenda is foundational principles of good regulatory practices and FDA's approach. And for this, I have the pleasure to introduce Kristen Callahan and Maria Keegan. Kristen is a public health advisor in the Office of Trade, Mutual Recognition, and International Arrangements in the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Office of Global Policy and Strategy. And Maria Keegan is a senior economist in FDA's Office of Economics and Analysis within the Office of Commissioner. I would like to welcome both. And with that, I think we're ready to share the screen and get started. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I know Marie and I have been very excited to prepare and discuss this with this group. So we're going to do introductions and then we'll get started. My name is Kristen Callahan. Like Visa said, I am a public health advisor. I'm in the Office of Global Policy and Strategy. And I've been in this office for about 3 years. And before joining the Office of Global Policy and Strategy as a whole, I actually was a regulatory counsel within FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, where I assisted in the drafting of rules as well as guidance documents. So I will pass it on to Maria to introduce herself and then we'll get started. Thank you.
Thanks, Kristen. Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Keegan. As Visa mentioned, I'm a senior economist. I have worked at FDA since 2017 in the Office of Economics and Analysis, and I handle regulatory impact analyses for FDA regulation. So I'm looking forward to speaking to you all about that part of good regulatory practices today, as well as the other good regulatory practices that FDA puts into practice. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So today, obviously, we're talking about good regulatory practices. And when we talk about that, GRPs, what we're talking about is internationally recognized processes and procedures that improve the quality and cost of effectiveness of a domestic regulation. In the regulations of medical devices, the World Health Organization describes how GRPs guide regulatory authorities in settings appropriate regulatory requirements and formulating decisions that are clear, transparent, consistent, timely, and based on sound science. So in the United States, GRPs are rooted in US law known as the Administrative Procedure Act. And that's really based in the 1940s and set forth in trade agreements. And GRPs are also included principles and procedures that address intergovernmental and intra-governmental coordination of rulemaking activity, impact assessment, regulatory transparency, stakeholder outreach and engagement, and accountability. Following GRPs promotes transparency in rulemaking and ensures that FDA coordinates with governmental, public, and international stakeholders to develop and implement regulations that meet our public health objectives, while also being consistent with our own US laws, policy, and trade commitments. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at here are three general principles of GRPs in the rulemaking process. So number one is promoting transparency and accessibility. Number two is the public consultation process, which in the United States, you'll hear us say the notice and comment process. And number three is the regulatory impact assessment. This presentation will focus on these three elements to highlight how they are integrated into FDA's rulemaking process. So specifically how FDA seeks stakeholder input through the rulemaking process from the beginning and early stages to the end, how we promote transparency and accessibility throughout the regulation development process, and how we develop and use regulatory impact analysis where applicable. Next slide, please. To do so, we're going to walk through the stages of the rulemaking process in the United States. So it includes the things that we're going to highlight are identifying regulatory priorities, developing a draft regulation. So that's including the preamble as well as the what we call the codified language, meaning the specific language in the rule, reviewing a draft regulation, the notice and comment period, so the public consultation on a proposed draft regulation, and issuing a final regulation. One thing I do want to say here before moving on is when I say rulemaking or regulation, really what I'm referring to is the definition that's based in our Administrative Procedure Act, which is a general statement issued by an agency, board, or commission that has the force and effect of law. So in other words, we're talking about binding action. Congress often directs agencies to issue regulations addressing particular topics, but this also could be something that an agency identifies based off of the authority that's given to them from Congress and a needing to provide additional oversight. Next slide, please. So creating and implementing new regulations is a resource and time intensive process. The need for and prioritization of new rules can arise from multiple sources in the United States. Congress may pass a law that directs an agency to take action on a certain subject to solve a particular problem or accomplish a certain goal. So for example, the FDA Food Safety Modernization Act that was signed into law in 2011 transformed the nation's food safety system by shifting the focus from responding to foodborne illness to preventing it. FDA has finalized 9 major rules to implement what we call FIFARMA, including in preventative controls for human and animal foods, sanitary transportation of human and animal foods, and the recently enhanced food traceability. Rulemaking can also reflect an administration department or FDA's public health priorities and recommendations. An example of that is FDA's 2018 update to the nutrition facts label, in part reflecting the administration's concerns and improved understanding about the harms of obesity and poor nutrition. Another area is the identifying the public health need or public health emergency. That one is pretty self-explanatory. And number 4 is rulemaking can also originate from other sources such as court decisions, petitions. So in the FDA, we call those citizen petitions, new data, technologies, or research, or advisory committee recommendations, or even from public comments coming out of requests for information. Which means that we have, FDA has asked the public to weigh in on a certain process, and the public comments may come in saying that we would prefer that this, that a regulation be developed. Next slide. So it's important to highlight that throughout the rulemaking process, FDA's goal is to engage all relevant stakeholders. I cannot stress this enough. The more comments FDA receives addressing the substance and the specifics of a proposed rule, we find that it's just a better final rule. So example of some key stakeholders are the consumers and patient groups, domestic and foreign industry, state, local, or tribal governments within the United States, foreign governments, including regulatory counterparts, academics and research institutions, and other public interest groups. You will hear me say throughout this presentation about how important it is that to receive stakeholder input, and I cannot stress that enough. I really can't. Next slide. So throughout this presentation, you'll see how FDA proactively engages with the public early and throughout the rulemaking process, from the early stages, even before we have a draft rule to present, to the proposed rule, to when it's issuing final rule. We actually sometimes have the docket remaining open. Regulators benefit directly from public participation in important ways. So supporting transparency, accountability, confidence, and trust in the rulemaking process. Producing a better regulation by allowing those affected to provide input to improve clarity of regulatory requirements and avoid unintended consequences. This has been said before, but sometimes regulators are not, they don't have the full picture or the knowledge to understand how a potential rule could affect the business processes. And so this input in the process of getting the input is a really important process to ensure that we do not create unintended consequences. Third, providing regulators with data and information to inform the rulemaking. And fourth, providing an understanding of how regulatory actions can have impacts beyond the country's borders. Next slide. So this is my last slide, and then I'll pass it on to Maria. But developing a draft regulation, like I said, is a part of the rulemaking process. So once we've identified the regulatory priorities, now FDA will take pen to paper essentially and develop a draft regulation. And as part of this process, we may hold public meetings. We may open a docket, so basically an online portals to receive comments on a specific scientific topic, or we may issue an advance notice of a proposed rulemaking to seek more information, to ask about data or ideas for alternatives to inform us on the development of this proposed rulemaking. A docket, like I had mentioned, it's a collection of documents related to rulemaking or other actions. So I personally think of it as almost like a virtual filing cabinet that the public can see. So you as an agency, we may issue an announcement about a public meeting related to a specific topic that leads us to the draft regulation, to the final. That will all be located under one docket number, and it's all available online on regulations.gov to allow for that transparency and ease of public comment. The federal government publishes, and this is an important point I wanted to stress, is a semi-annual agenda of upcoming regulations in the Federal Register. It's usually in the spring and fall. On FDA's web page, we actually maintain an updated agenda of the agency's upcoming rulemakings. But there is a complete unified agenda of regulatory and deregulatory actions that's available broadly for the whole US government on reginfo.gov. In addition to serving as a planning tool, the unified agenda promotes transparency, facilitates public engagement from an early stage, and allows the public to track planned rulemaking from beginning to end. So it's essentially like a tip-off of what FDA is about to announce. FDA may consult on scientific and technical or policy matters with an established advisory committee. Right now, FDA has about 31 advisory committees that are either mandated by statute or established at the discretion of the Department of Health and Human Services, so our parent agency, and are comprised of academic and industry experts, as well as public health advocates and patient representatives. Some examples of FDA advisory committees are the Human Drug Advisory Committees, the Food Advisory Committee, the Science Board to the Food and Drug Administration. We also have more narrowly tailored committees such as the Cellular, Tissue, and Gene Therapies Advisory Committee. FDA actually has a whole office that supports the advisory committee efforts, and they post vacancies periodically, and positions are filled based on a careful evaluation of the nominated experts to ensure there's no conflicts. They are required to provide detailed information so that we can ensure that there's no conflict of interest. Scientifically, FDA evaluates available solutions to identify regulatory approach that best addresses a public health objective. So for example, FDA considers existing voluntary consensus standards, including international standards, unless doing so would be inappropriate because, for instance, the standard does not meet the public health objective, or it's just too impractical because of the technical or legal issues. So in other words, an authority coming from Congress cannot allow us to implement an international standard. So by law, draft regulations and other agency documents must abide by the principles of plain language or plain writing. And really what that means is that we try to be clear, concise, well organized in our communications so the public can use and understand our communications. And with that, I'm going to pass that on to Maria for the next slide.
Thank you, Kristen. So far, Kristen has really been emphasizing the importance of transparency and public participation early in the rulemaking process. Something else that occurs early and throughout the rulemaking process is the development of the regulatory impact assessment, which we call the regulatory impact analysis. This is another important best practice that we want to spend a little time emphasizing today. So what is regulatory impact analysis? It is a well-established approach within the international community among bodies such as the WHO, OECD, for collecting, organizing, and analyzing data on the impacts of policy options, and that is to support evidence-based policy making. So when it's applicable, an RIA can provide an objective assessment that is really an essential component of policy development. And it considers both qualitative and quantitative impacts. So often we think of the quantitative aspects first, right? But qualitative aspects can be equally important. And it's often easier to quantify costs stemming from new regulatory requirements and may be more challenging to quantify benefits, such as the improvements to health or safety that result from those regulatory requirements. But by taking a broad view of the quantitative and qualitative impacts, the regulatory impact analysis can provide a comprehensive consideration of impacts, and in that way can inform policy decisions along with other information such as legal requirements, policy goals, and so on. Next slide, please. So why do we conduct RIAs? What are the benefits to regulators from going through this process? Well, stepping back, an important goal of the RIA is to indicate whether regulation is necessary and justified to achieve a social goal. And if the answer is yes to that, clarify how to design regulations in the way that is most efficient, least burdensome, and most cost-effective. And the ultimate goal is to be able to identify the regulatory option that is going to be most economically efficient, or that can provide the largest net benefits to society. And of course, we also have other considerations, such as the distributive impacts of those regulations, as well as I just mentioned, the qualitative benefits and costs, unless a different approach is required by statute. So a well-conducted RIA develops evidence to support well-informed decision-making. And it also, along with the administrative record, supplies a record of the data, assumptions, and analyses considered in developing the rule. So the RIA plays a number of other useful roles, and I'll just highlight a couple. As I mentioned, it encourages comprehensive consideration of impacts, which can include impacts on subpopulations. It provides information on important regulatory outcomes expressed in physical and/or behavioral terms, as well as estimates the economic value of outcomes. So in this way, it helps to identify trade-offs and helps policymakers to make decisions between different policy alternatives. RIAs also can assist in anticipating potential side effects, which can be both beneficial and adverse. And it also supports, as I mentioned, consideration of non-quantifiable effects and uncertainty. So being able to convey uncertainty to decision makers is also critical. Finally, throughout the process of developing an RIA, because it needs to break down a regulation into precisely what it's attempting to do, that can aid decision makers and stakeholders in clarifying areas of agreement and disagreement by really getting into the exact details of what a regulation is attempting to do. So stepping back here, I'm obviously talking about the US approach, but I do want to mention that the OECD has developed best practice principles for RIAs. And of course, different countries make different determinations about how and when to use RIAs in the development of regulations. So that is for targeting resources to particular regulations where they might be most useful. Next slide, please. So in the US, when is an RIA generally conducted? So we have an executive order that established the regulatory philosophy and principles related to when agencies undertake regulations and what agencies should consider when developing regulations. So in that executive order is called Executive Order 12866 on regulatory planning and review. That was in 1993. And so an agency must identify the nature and assess the significance of the problem it intends to address, as specified in that executive order, as well as possible alternative solutions to address the problem. And where possible, as I mentioned earlier, select the approach or the approaches that maximize net benefits to society. And very interestingly, that executive order was recently amended in 2023 by Executive Order 14094, which is on modernizing regulatory review. So under these executive orders, it provides guidance about when a regulatory impact analysis would be applicable. And those are often in the case of significant or economically significant rules. So what are significant rules? Those are rules that are economically significant, which I'll explain in a minute, but they're rules that might otherwise create a serious inconsistency or interfere with another agency's action. They may materially alter the budgetary funding of a federal program, or they may raise legal or policy issues for which centralized review would meaningfully further the president's priorities. Economically significant rules are a subset of significant rules, and they would have an annual effect on the economy of $200 million or more, which will now be adjusted every 3 years for changes in GDP. They may adversely affect in a material way the economy or a sector of the economy, productivity, or competition generally, or they may adversely affect specific states, local, or tribal governments or communities. So using these criteria is a way to target when RIAs are conducted for particular regulation. One point I also want to mention is that RIAs also examine the impact of the regulation on small entities. I spoke about subpopulations earlier, but the Regulatory Flexibility Act actually instructs us to identify the small entities affected by a regulation, estimate the cost per small business, and then identify options that would reduce the burden on small entities. So from here, in the regulation development process, I'll now move on to the review process on the next slide, please. So once developed, a draft regulation goes through an intensive review process to ensure that it is consistent with other US government priorities, and then, as Kristen mentioned, applicable laws and international obligations. So following the executive order I mentioned, EO 12866, the Office of Management and Budget coordinates interagency review of significant and economically significant rules. And specifically, it's a component of OMB called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which we pronounce as OIRA. So in this role, OIRA facilitates feedback from other US government departments and agencies on FDA's proposed rules. So I want to also mention that at this stage, the rule is not published, but there are other ways that the US government tries to facilitate public participation, even at this stage. So first, reginfo.gov maintains a dashboard that provides information about regulatory actions that are actually under that 12866 review. You can go to reginfo.gov and take a look at that if you're interested. Also during this stage, even though the rule is still unpublished, stakeholders may request what are known as 12866 meetings with OMB OIRA to discuss a rule under review. So in those meetings, OMB can listen and ask questions, but they don't respond to any stakeholder issues because the rule is not yet published. Next slide, please. So after OMB review, after feedback has been addressed, FDA would publish the draft regulation in the Federal Register. The preamble, as Kristen mentioned earlier, the preamble to the rule will give the necessary background to the rule. It'll explain why the agency is proposing specific requirements. It'll provide notice to the public for commenting, and it will also include a summary of the economic analysis of impacts and a link to the complete RAA, which is published separately on FDA's public-facing webpage. So if it was not already opened at an earlier stage, a docket for the rule would be set up at regulations.gov, and that having that platform really allows for ease of public comment and for transparency. So as a reminder of what the docket is, it's this folder that's part of the administrative record for the rulemaking. At this stage too, when a proposed rule could impact international trade and FDA regulated products, FDA would also notify the appropriate US point of contact to notify the corresponding WTO committee. When the comment period begins, any stakeholder can submit a comment into the docket, and this includes foreign entities, individuals, regulatory counterparts. The comments posted into the docket are publicly available, and any comments received through the WTO inquiry point on a proposed rule from another WTO member would be incorporated into the docket as well. The comment period itself typically ranges from 90 to 120 days. We often receive requests to extend the comment period and make decisions about doing that on a case-by-case basis. Again, the engagement with the public does not stop even during the public comment period. So during this period, especially for rules that are complex, FDA may hold listening sessions or public meetings, public workshops to facilitate and support public participation on the proposed rule. We also will communicate to stakeholders in a variety of ways through listservs, constituent email updates, social media, fact sheets, really trying to get the word out and ensure that the public has ample time to participate. Next slide, please. Thank you. So once the comment period closes, FDA will review every comment filed during this period. Any comments not received in the docket before the end of this period will not be considered. The volume of comments can vary significantly depending on the rule. I've seen 10 comments, I've seen over 10,000 comments. However, the process for addressing these public comments is quite similar, regardless of the number, and it's similar across federal agencies. So we did want to take a few minutes to walk through that process because this is very critical for understanding and processing all of the feedback that's received from the public on our proposed rules. So in the first step, what we will typically do is gather comments. Those have unique identifiers because they're uploaded to the docket. And they may include information about the commenter, or it may be submitted anonymously. After the comments have been gathered together, we'll attempt to consolidate them. Sometimes this involves identifying form letters, which are becoming increasingly common. There may be duplicate submissions or comments that are unrelated to or outside the scope of the rule as well. We will identify issues raised by each comment, categorizing the issues by substance and topic so that comments on the same topic can be addressed together. At that stage, we can prepare high-level summaries of the comments received, and we take a lot of care to identify any specific recommendations as well as additional evidence, data, studies that comments have provided that might inform the proposed rule. Internally, we will discuss and prepare recommended responses, and those responses should include explanations for why the agency incorporates or does not incorporate a comment's recommendations into the final rule. So after considering the comments, we would draft the final rule and then clearly reference any changes within the responses to comments, which are included in the preamble to the final rule. And we wanted to go through this because this is not just performative. Rules do change between the proposed and final rule because of comments received. The change may be related to the information required in forms. It could be related to formats on labels. There could also be changes relating to who is covered by a particular regulation, if there are particular exemptions for small entities and that sort of thing. So this is a very important step, and we do spend significant time in considering these comments. Next slide, please. So once the comments have been reviewed, if the rule moves to the final drafting phase, as I mentioned, the preamble to the final rule will respond to the comments received that are within scope of the rulemaking. And as I indicated on the last slide, we typically organize comments by topic. and will also describe any changes to the rule based on those comments received by topic and in the preamble to the final rule. So our responses really address the issues submitted by commenter. We're not individually responding to every single comment, even though they've all been considered. At this stage, OMB also will review significant final regulations and coordinates the comment and feedback process with the interagency as described earlier through the 12866 framework. After all that internal, external feedback has been evaluated and addressed, FDA would then publish the final rule in the Federal Register and notify the appropriate WTO committee if there are potential international impacts of the final regulation and its effective date. One point we did want to mention too is that FDA will periodically review the effectiveness of the rule, and this is in accordance first with the Regulatory Flexibility Act, and that's the act I mentioned earlier that directs agencies to consider impacts on small entities. So it also directs agencies to periodically review regulations that have a significant economic impact on small entities. And also Executive Order 13563 directs agencies to conduct retrospective analysis of existing rules and produce preliminary plans for a periodic review of final rules. So this is in order to take stock of the total regulatory burden and make sure there is an awareness of whether there have been changes moving forward. Lastly, just to close on the public participation point, OMB OIRA is also currently working to develop learnings and potential recommendations on broadening public engagement in the federal rulemaking process, especially for members of underserved communities who may not typically participate in this notice and comment process. Next slide, please. So we'll wrap up here. So we really hope that this presentation has been able to illustrate key principles in good regulatory practice and how FDA utilizes public consultation, transparency, and accessibility, and regulatory impact assessment throughout the entire rulemaking process to make sure it's effective and it's cohesive. FDA is obviously strongly committed to implementing good regulatory practices at all stages of rulemaking. So you've seen how we have walked through, from the initial development through the final rule. There are ample opportunities for the public to participate, and FDA makes an effort to facilitate those processes throughout. We believe these processes are foundational to developing regulations that protect and promote public health. And we did want to leave plenty of time for questions, so we will wrap up here and we would be very happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria and Kristen, for that great presentation. I just want to remind everyone that there is an option to ask questions. It's through the questions and answer box. I believe that you've also received a chat notification about that. So we encourage questions. This is an opportunity to ask our experts questions. So I do see a couple questions in the chat, so I'll go ahead and we try to address those. We have a question from Sandra. She says, great presentation and thank you. And also indicates a question, does seeking for input from stakeholders include through notification to the TBT WTO?
Yes, the answer is yes. So the World Trade Organization Technical Barriers to Trade Committee, there's the inquiry point that is managed not by, obviously the regulator, it's managed by a different office under the Department of Commerce, but they will immediately send us any comments that are received through the Technical Barriers to Trade inquiry point. So we will receive them directly from that agency that handles that. But on top of that, they will submit those comments to the Federal Register docket, so that that virtual filing cabinet that I was talking about. They will submit the comments there. So it's a part of essentially the administrative record. And so when it's time, when the comment period closes and it's time to start consolidating and looking at the comments, those comments will be definitely included in the process for the scoping of how to respond. One thing I wanted to mention that Maria did discuss, which is about the preamble. We've been talking about the preamble of rules, and really what we were talking about there is, we have the draft rule, but it's before that, there's like essentially an introductory information about what the rule is, where we have the authority to make that rule, and how did this rule come about? Like what gap are we trying to address, or was this, just coming from Congress saying you have to do this? And so in that, when it comes to the final rule, like Maria said, that's where we would address those comments. So if we were to get something through the GPT inquiry point that then is submitted to the docket, assuming that is within scope, it will most likely be addressed generally in the preamble of the final rule.
Thank you very much, Kristen, for that. There's another question. Does FDA answer the comments to each stakeholder that has sent the comments?
So we review all the comments that come in, as long as they were submitted during the comment period. And the way we structure our responses is by topic. So we will group comments on similar topics, raising similar issues together, and create summaries that capture the substance of those comments. And then we target our responses by addressing the substance of those comments. So we're not answering every single commenter individually, but we are reviewing all of the comments and synthesizing them into our comment summaries and responses.
Kristen or Maria, could you maybe provide an example of how FDA has considered those comments? And you both mentioned the importance of receiving that input and engaging with the public. Could you provide maybe an example of how FDA has incorporated those comments?
So there, if you look up at any of our rulemaking process in the Federal Register, you'll be able to see it in that preamble. But to give a specific example that's fresh on my mind is we have, this is related to devices, but the unique device identifier, it was a proposed rule back in 2012. And in that we had suggested, it's actually a pretty simple fix, but it was a huge, it would have created a lot of burden, which was we had the date format that we needed manufacturers to submit for devices. We had suggested just doing month, day, year, and actually we got a lot of feedback that, internationally, that's just not really conducive to how the format usually works for, their systems generally. And so based off of that feedback that, we didn't have that, that kind of intellect in terms of how the business processes go. So based off of the comments, we switched it to actually year, month, day. So that made it, that's along with international standards. So we just made sure that we were aligned in that sense. So that's a rule from 2000. It was announced in 2012 and it was finalized in 2013.
Thank you very much for that. I actually would like to invite my colleague, Patty. Patty, I see there's some questions in Spanish, and I'm hoping that you're able to read those for us.
Sure. There's one, the first one is easy. They are asking if the presentation are going to be shared by any of the communication channels, and they really appreciate if this can be done. So I guess that one is for our hosts, FIFARMA, if they are going to be sharing it in their website or something. So I don't know, Diego or Tony, Santiago, did you know?
Yeah, for sure. We can share the PowerPoint presentation with all the attendees.
Okay, Perfect, thank you. So the next question, and this is a long one for our speakers. They said that it's excellent presentation, thank you. And regarding the RIAs, usually it is needed to maintain records and metrics of the strategies for certain indicators that are relevant to a specific regulation, okay? So they would like to ask you if you could elaborate in detail about what are or who are the entities that are in charge of generating this coordination. So all the records and metrics are maintained and they are under or within the timelines. And then they are useful to assess the actual regulatory impact, either in when issuing for the first time a new rule, and also for any assessment afterwards of the specific rule. So I don't know if that's clear.
I think so. So
Okay, cool.
just to restate kind of a question about the data and how the data can be used in generating the economic analysis, but also in looking retrospectively at regulations. That's what I understood in any case. So feel free to correct me if I don't answer your question. But data is always a very challenging issue, because when developing an RIA, it is prospective, right? It is not retrospective. We do not have the information necessarily that we would like to have to be able to study the impact. So in this way, we may, at the time of developing the regulation, depending on the timeline, we may be able to conduct surveys or solicit input from experts through expert elicitation, or try to gather information essentially in other ways that can inform the economic analysis of impacts, but also that can inform the rule itself, right? Same goes for once the rule has been published. It could be possible to develop surveys or develop particular indicators that we can then use to look back retrospectively and look at the actual effects of the regulation as it's coming into force. And that is typically easier to do because we actually are observing some outcome as opposed to anticipating what the potential outcome would be. So I hope I answered your question, but feel free to follow up if I did not.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Patty. So Maria, I think this may be along the same lines. A RIA is only is an RIA only fully conducted by FDA, or does the U.S. government have another centralized body that also conducts the review of the RIA?
So the RIAs, so we're just talking about the FDA here. The FDA conducts RIAs for our own regulations. The other agencies will conduct RIAs for their own regulations. So the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Environmental Protection Agency, all of these agencies would be conducting RIAs that are associated to their particular proposed and final regulations. And then those go through the centralized review process that I was referring to earlier. So they go to the Office of Management and Budget and the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. And that centralized body is responsible for coordinating the review of all the RIAs from the different agencies.
Thank you for that clarification. The other question is, how long does it take for the comment period?
So typically, it can range from the comment period ranges from 30 days to about 120, but we actually a lot of times, you know, depending if a rule is gathered, if it gets a lot of attention and there's a lot of comments, we will just extend the comment period for another 120 days. to make sure that we have a complete picture from all the different stakeholders. But yeah, it's usually for us, it's usually on average between 90 to 120 days for the comment period.
Thank you, Kristen. Patty, can I invite you to read the next question, please?
Sure. So the next one is, when the pandemic broke, a lot of hand sanitizer manufacturers had problems with methanol contamination. And in that context, a new methodology was put in place for methanol, which changed the industry. So from there, I have questions because it looks like currently the FDA is not issuing approvals for this kind of products. So derived from this, is this derived from the change in labeling or requirements for these products?
So I think that's specific to the issue that was identified with the hand sanitizers during the pandemic. And there was a lot of, because the FDA had to act quickly on that, they're in trying to convey the communication about where we stood on, not only the process on how to make hand sanitizers, because there was a lot of hands on deck essentially to ensure that the supply stayed up. So there was guidances issued pretty quickly, but those were announced, bringing this back to good regulatory practices, those were announced through the Federal Register. But when it came to the actual issues with manufacturing, that's not a good regulatory practice issue. That's more on our import side, that's dealt directly with our import office. So hopefully that answers the question even just slightly. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. We have time for, I think, for a few more questions. The next question is, with the advancement of innovative technologies such as gene therapies, does the FDA interact closely with the health technology assessment area or department, if there is one? And when deciding whether issuing or not a final rule related to this topic? And the second part of the question is, would the decision be based on a more national perspective, or would also be based on other regions, or consider other regions, such as the socioeconomic situation of developing countries?
So I can talk more broadly. I mean, one, I think when we talk about, for instance, like innovative technology, this actually brings up a good point that, we've emphasized getting input from all stages of the rulemaking process. And when people think rulemaking, at least before this presentation, maybe after you'll think differently, but beforehand, you may think it's just when you initially issue that draft regulation. But we actually will try, when it's innovative technologies, we try the office that would develop policies and regulations based off of that would most likely seek input from the businesses that directly involve innovative technology. So they would seek like a public meeting, or maybe they would do what we call a request for information. And so what that means is we'll ask questions like, how do these companies, what effects would this, if we added a regulation about this aspect of gene therapy, would that help or hinder innovation, things like that. So that's where we try to get input from our office that specifically deals with, for instance, in this case, gene therapies, and getting business input before we even start drafting the regulation. In terms of, trying to gain better perspective about regionally what happens, I had mentioned, sometimes the stakeholders can be actually our state governments. So that means like for us, that could be a regional point. So for instance, tobacco, there's quite a number of regulations that have come out over the past 10 years, given how tobacco is essentially a newer area of oversight for FDA in relative terms. And so with that, there are other regions within the United States that have more input on, the import processes of tobacco restrictions. So state governments weigh in on that. And so we'll hear regionally how this potential regulation could affect their situation, as well as we hear from other countries, whether it's through the WTO technical barriers to trade inquiry point that I had mentioned a couple minutes ago, or it could be that we actually just hear directly from them. They issue letters that are then posted to the Federal Register docket. Sometimes our offices will be contacted by a country or entity about a proposed rule that they see, and usually we will direct them to the Federal Register docket, so to make sure that that's a part of the administrative record and that comment actually gets included in the consideration of the final drafting of the rule. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question says, when a regulatory suggestion or proposal is not accepted by the FDA, do you publicly justify the reason for non-acceptance?
So if what the question intends is regulatory suggestions that are proposed by through the public comment process, yes, FDA will respond to the substance of those comments and explain why a particular action is taken or not taken. The regulatory impact analysis will also include an assessment of alternatives. So alternatives to the regulation being pursued, and describe the potential impacts of those alternatives, as well as the reasoning behind whether or not, why they were not pursued.
Thank you, Maria. There's a question, I think it's asking if you could please clarify who was the centralized body or agency that coordinates the review of the RIA, I believe.
Yes, it's the Office of Management and Budget, and within the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs.
Thank you. Has there been any instance when, because of the input from stakeholders, a need to update an international standard has been identified?
That is a good question. I don't have an example off the top of my head, and so I will have to think. I'll have to think back and respond through the participants or through the organizers to get back to them.
Okay. Thank you, Kristen. Do you consider any other improvement opportunities for implementing in GRPs? How can this actions impact?
I'll take that and maybe pass it on to Maria, because I know there are improvements that Maria is very well informed about. So one is, GRPs are not they're not just stable. They don't just stay in one place and you don't hear anything else about them. They are very much policies and approaches that are constantly being evaluated and improved year by year. And for the United States, our administration, so the president's office, will consider, what we've mentioned, executive orders to improve good regulatory practices, essentially. And so every couple of years, you'll see a new executive order that adds or clarifies what the role of an agency is for how to improve a certain aspect of communication or just the process in general. So I'll pass it on to Maria to talk a specific example.
Sure. Yeah, just to follow on from what Kristen was saying. So for example, the previous administration was very much focused on deregulation. so executive orders were put into place focused on looking for deregulatory actions that agencies could take. This administration is very much focused on the distributive impacts of regulations, and so making sure all stakeholders are have the opportunity to have their voices heard, especially if they're not typically participating in the regulatory development process. And so related to that, there have been OIRA has been developing new guidance for how to reach these populations that are maybe underserved in the current rulemaking process. And in addition, there have also been recent proposed updates to what is called Circular A4, which is the guidance that governs how we or guides how we develop regulatory impact analyses, and that's to update for new economic evidence, new practices. And so it's an ongoing process. As Kristen said, these are not static. We're always seeking ways to improve.
Thank you. I think we're pretty much, out of time for this particular presentation. I think there's been a lot of great questions. I see a lot more questions on the chat. Kristen and Maria, if you have additional time, I would invite you maybe to answer those in writing if you can, or otherwise we can try to answer those through the hosts and provide the answers at a later time. Thank you very much for your time and excellent presentations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. At this time, I think we'll continue on with the agenda. The next topic on the agenda is going to be, we're going to have representatives from FIFARMA for good regulatory practices, enabling regulatory efficiencies to deliver medicines in a timely manner to Latin America and the Caribbean. And for this presentation, I would like to welcome Camila Gomez and Maria Roman. Camila is the specialist in global health and health regulation. She has a broad experience in regulatory policy, both as government and industry, leading or contributing to bilateral and multilateral negotiations, harmonizations, and convergent initiatives. She currently has a position as a regulatory policy lead for Latin America in Roche Pharma, and in a role of FIFARMA, she's a member of the GRP subgroup. Welcome, Camila. And joining Camila is also Maria, and she's a pharmacist by training, and she has 31 years of experience in the pharmaceutical and biological production industries in areas such as research and development, quality assurance and control, quality systems, regulatory affairs, and undergraduate and postgraduate teaching. She currently holds the position of head of regulatory policy for Latin America at Novartis, and she's also a lead of the Reliance subgroup within the regulatory group of FIFARMA. Welcome, both of you, and feel free to take it over and share the screen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Vesa, for this introduction. And I'll be running the first half of the presentation and then passing the ball to my colleague, Maria Antonieta, or Tony, to finalize the presentation. So you can go to the next slide, please. So a little bit of history on FIFARMA, right? Who are we representing here? So we are the Latin American Federation of Pharmaceutical Companies. We were created many decades ago, and nowadays we count with 27 members. And not only companies are members of FIFARMA, but also local industry associations of different countries and regions in Latin America. So if you are currently in one of those countries, you might recognize the industry association logo in this slide. Next slide, please. In FIFARMA, we as companies and industry associations, we try to be as connected as we can to the health agenda of the region that we support. So the idea is that we engage with different stakeholders in not only Latin America, but I would say in the Caribbean as well, to create better quality of life for people. And we do that in three main areas: health policies, access to innovation, because we represent the innovation industry here in our region, and the regulatory affairs. In the area of regulatory affairs, we have identified some of the pillars of our work, such as reliance, pharmacovigilance, new approaches to clinical evidence, and one very important pillar for us is the promotion of good regulatory practices in the region. And this is why we are collaborating with the US FDA to come to you today and hopefully sometime in the future as well with more information and promote this knowledge sharing experience, also from the perspective of industry. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, we are here to give our perspective in good regulatory practices. I ask you to please stay with me, because good regulatory practices can sometimes be a very boring subject, especially if you're presenting it from a theoretical perspective, right? So we will try to be as concrete as we can in our examples to you today in communicating what are the thoughts and visions of our federation for where countries and especially health regulators in our region can be in terms of implementing those good regulatory practices. Next slide, please. So this is a quote from the WHO guideline on good regulatory practices for medical products. It was published in 2021. I'm going to come back to this document a few times during this presentation. And it says that good regulatory practices are this set of principles and practices that are applied to the development, implementation, and maintenance of regulatory instruments in order to achieve a public health policy objective in the most efficient way. You just saw in the US FDA presentation a very concrete example of how this is done by our colleagues in the United States, right? And how advanced and sophisticated their procedures are. Good regulatory practices then can be translated as some, not specifically of what the regulator does, but how the regulator does it. So it's applicable to everyone, right? And in the scenario where we have evolving science and regulatory challenges, the WHO has stresses the value of having efficient regulatory systems, because according to them, inefficient regulatory systems can be themselves a barrier to access to safe, effective, and quality medical products, meaning pharmaceuticals, medical devices, right? Next slide, please. And this is very important for our region. This is data from a 2021 report of the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, and that shows a little bit how the systems, regulatory systems are structured in our region. And you will see that there is good room for improvement, right? One reflection that we as industry like to make is that the quality of the regulatory protection, or better said, the sanitary protection that you receive in a given country, the quality of the sanitary protection that one receives should not depend on the country that this person is born, right? So we should make all the efforts that are necessary that to allow populations in all around the globe to have access to adequate products with the adequate safety, efficacy, and quality. Here in the region of the Americas, you will see that we still have many countries that have very limited or even no organizational frameworks for regulation. And if you match that with what we just spoke, that inefficient regulatory systems might be a barrier to quality products, you put one and one together, and you will see that inefficient regulatory systems are present in our region, and good regulatory practices might be one of the ways that governments can take a look at improving the regulatory, this regulatory situation. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned to you, my talk will be a little bit focused on the WHO side and the WHO guidelines. The WHO has a program for regulatory system strengthening, and when I say WHO, it's important to state, as we are talking about the Americas region, that the same is valid for the Pan American Health Organization as the office of the WHO for the Americas, right? And you will see that the WHO is trying to promote better regulatory systems, or stronger regulatory systems, more mature regulatory systems, by promoting good regulatory practices, and also other aspects such as regulatory cooperation, work sharing, and reliance. And these visuals are actually taken from presentations from WHO, and you see that the GRP, the good regulatory practices, and the GRELP, the good reliance practices, are central in these efforts of promoting better regulatory systems. So this is why for us, for instance, in FIFARMA, those are also two central areas of activity in our regulatory efforts. Next slide, please. So just to emphasizing here that the promotion and support then for the GRP implementation is one of the pillars of WHO efforts to strengthen regulatory systems in all regions of the globe. Next slide, please. I'll spend some time in this slide to try and connect some of those efforts that we mentioned, and please take into consideration that here we are talking from the perspective of pharmaceuticals. Okay, so for medicines, there is a document that some of you might be aware of that is called the WHO Global Benchmarking Tool. Is basically an assessment tool for regulatory systems, for them to understand strengths and also potential areas for improvement. And in these documents that is now starting to be used globally to benchmark regulatory systems, the good regulatory practices are embedded. It would be very complicated we could have like a whole webinar on the GBT, so I'm not going to go deeper into that. But the GBT refers to many in a cross-cutting manner to many of those principles of the good regulatory practices that I'm going to discuss here with you today. And it's very, I think that as we are talking to people in the Americas, it's very interesting to note that this assessment tool from WHO for medicines and vaccines was highly based, largely based on an assessment that already existed and has been created in our region and implemented by the Pan American Health Organization. I usually say that very proudly because it's something that started in the Americas and enabled WHO to build a stronger regulatory tool to be applied worldwide. So let's go a little bit to these those principles that are in the WHO guideline. So in no particular order here, right? So we can take, for instance, start with the principle of legality. This principle of legality is basically exposing that any regulatory systems should be structured such that all regulatory actions and all regulatory decisions are based on a clear legal authority, and so they respect what is called the rule of law, right? The WHO guideline specifically states that because, as you know, regulators, they can only do things if those things are embedded in the law, in the regulations, regardless of the legal system, right? Of the fact that you need to have something in a written format for the regulated sector to follow, and for the regulator to be sure of how to implement a specific rule, then it would be necessary, right? Another interesting principle here, maybe to highlight, is the principle of consistency. Consistency basically means that the regulation of medical products must be performed in the context of and in ways that are coherent with the national legal framework, general government policies, and also public health policy objectives. So that means that the pieces must fit together, right? They have to be, the regulations, they have to be implemented and enforced in a consistent manner, right? And a very important aspect, for instance, of consistency is that the regulations must complement and not conflict with each other. And this is very important because in the process of developing regulations, this is an area that must be observed. So when we talk, for instance, about a regulatory impact assessment, such as our colleagues from the FDA brought to us, this is one of the things that must be observed. So is the new regulation or the revised regulation conflicting with others? What are the regulatory options? What to do in this scenario? Another specific principle is the principle of independence, right? And this is a very important one, and one that not always is correctly considered by different governments. Institutions that are responsible for the regulation of medical products, they should be independent, right? Technically independent, and must take on board legitimate interests and protect themselves from inappropriate or undue influence. And that means not only this inappropriate or undue influence is not only maybe the most visible type of influence is the one that usually the regulated sector wants to bring to the government, which might be legitimate or might be undue. But another very interesting aspect that is worth highlighting here is that this influence can come from the government itself, right? We had many instances, and I will not bring specific examples. Most probably those of you who are in the call will know those examples by heart, but we understand that there might be, for instance, political interference in the technical work of the regulator, which is not what we would like to happen. So when WHO talks about this independence, it's not that they're talking that to have an agency that is completely independent from other structures of the government. It's not exactly like that. You can have, for instance, a health authority working within the Ministry of Health, but that has sufficient technical independence not to be subjected to undue influence or undue political influence or inappropriate influence from any other stakeholder. Another relevant principle to highlight is the principle of impartiality. That goes to the fact that all the parties that are regulated by the regulator should be treated equitably, fairly, and without bias. This is completely connected also to the, actually all principles are interconnected, right? One is not more important than the other, but the idea here is that the regulator is able to take decisions that are free of conflict of interest and also unfounded bias. Another relevant principle to highlight here is the principle of proportionality, right? Here I'll make a very, I would like to highlight that this is very important in the context also of regulatory convergence, and I'll explain myself in a minute. So the regulatory oversight, according to this WHO recommendation, should be proportional to the risk and also to the regulator's capacity to implement and enforce decisions. And we have seen in that graph that I showed in the beginning that we have regulators with different levels of maturity, so different levels of capacity. Nevertheless, the regulation, because it's based on science, it should be valid worldwide. So how to do this balance, right? And this is what the principle of proportionality tells us, right? So you have to create regulations that can be enforced, properly enforced at the local level. So it's only natural that in countries with more developed regulatory systems, for instance, and more mature regulators, the granularity and the level of details of the regulation is more sophisticated than, for instance, in other countries where the regulator does not have this type of maturity yet, or might even not reach this level of maturity in the future. So proportionality is linked a lot with some things that you're going to see, for instance, in the presentation of our colleague from ANVISA, who is going to bring some ideas on how reliance is the implementation of good regulatory practices. So I will not go deeper into that subject, right? Another very important principle, and one that we have seen very highlighted during the recent COVID-19 pandemic, is the principle of flexibility, right? So the regulatory oversight must be able to respond to a changing environment and also to unforeseen circumstances. And that communicates quite well with when we talk about innovation. If you do have a very restricted or very, I'm missing the word, but if you have a very rigid, yes, this is the word that I was looking for. If you have a very rigid regulatory system, or actually if you have a very rigid regulation, then you are not able to, over time, adapt the implementation of this regulation to different and innovative products that might be coming into your market, what will require the constant update, for instance, of this regulation, which is not the ideal scenario. So a certain level of flexibility is necessary for you to be able, as a regulator and as a regulated sector, to go along this changing environment. And when it comes to the unforeseen circumstances, I think it was pretty clear that during the pandemic, regulators basically had to reinvent themselves, not only the regulators, but the regulated sector to some extent. And a good degree of flexibility was exercised without losing the focus on the quality, safety, and efficacy of the products that must be delivered to the market. So it was a very interesting time to observe the actual application of this principle of flexibility. Another principle is clarity, right? Basically, regulatory requirements should be accessible and understood by the users. And here, it's interesting it might seem very obvious, right? But usually it's not. And it tells a little bit about how complex sometimes making regulations can be. And it goes to the importance of hearing your stakeholders, because something that might be clear for those who are working on a regulation might not be clear for those who have to abide to that regulation. So clarity is absolutely connected to a next principle, which will be transparency, right? And I dare to say that transparency is the hallmark of a well-functioning regulatory system, and it's absolutely essential for building public trust and enabling also international cooperation. So we have seen with the examples brought to you by the FDA, how they increasingly improve the ways to be transparent in how they think about regulation, and how they build regulations, and how they hear the stakeholders in building this regulation, how they answer those stakeholders. So this principle of transparency maybe is the most visible principle of the good regulatory practice, alongside the principle of efficiency, right? And here, the regulatory systems, they have to achieve some intended results with the required time and the reasonable effort and cost. So being efficient is achieving your goal in an efficient way. Well, repeating myself, but basically taking the time and reasonable time and effort and cost for this goal that you want to achieve. And it's interesting here that when we analyze, for instance, this principle of efficiency, it goes also, if you go to the WHO guideline, you will see that it's also intrinsically connected to the fact that regulations cannot create barriers to trade. And this is highlighted also by WHO. The work of the regulator, they have to be proportional to the perceived risk. They have to be supportive to innovation, and also not pose these necessary barriers to trade. I think I've covered all the principles. So I'll and again, this is very hard to digest. It's a topic that is hard to digest, and I hope that the next part of the presentation with my colleague Maria Antonieta will bring a little bit more of concreteness to all of those theoretical examples that I brought to you. Next slide, please. So when the WHO launched this document, we in FIFARMA, we had the possibility of updating our position when it comes to the implementation of good regulatory practices in the region. The way that industry associations usually work is that the members agree on activities, they meet, and they also build positions or position papers, collective positions. And this is a quote from our position paper on good regulatory practices, updated in 2022 after the publication of the WHO, when you will see that we are absolutely supportive of the implementation by regulators of those good regulatory practices. And not only supportive, we are also actively working and willing to partner with different stakeholders in the region to make that more visible and more doable for different regulatory authorities that we work in partnership with. Next slide. And I think this is my last slide, which is bringing for you a little bit of the information which is in our position paper, right? FIFARMA sees that there are areas of opportunity here in our region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, to support stronger regulatory systems by further implementing good regulatory practices. Because, and we think that those areas of opportunities are embracing technology, ensuring consistency in the application of regulatory guidance, embedding transparency initiatives and principles to the work of the regulatory authority. In that way, supporting innovation. As I mentioned, everything is absolutely correlated to the principles that are in the WHO guideline. And now I will invite my colleague, Maria Antonieta, to present to you a little bit more of a call for action from our industry on how to do this implementation for different countries in our region. Thanks a lot, Tony.
Thank you very much, Tammy, for your brilliant presentation. So now I'm glad to share with you our call for action and some practical recommendations that we have for implementation of regulatory practices by regulators in our region, in Latin America and the Caribbean. So, well, some of our recommendations are, first, the formulation of an institutional development plan. It's important for the authorities to really have a plan in place to demonstrate which are the actions that they will take to tackle the challenges, some weaknesses that have been found along the history. So it's important to describe how that will be covered. Also, a basic item for efficient regulatory systems is the implementation of a quality management system. It's important to define how the regulatory processes are designed, how they work, which are the key performance indicators, which are the actions that are taken in case of, any deviations or any issues, how they are documented. And in terms of development of regulations, for example, it's very important to have a record or to track the changes to the regulations and to provide always a rationale for those changes, to have the history. This is very important. And whenever there's an issue, to document how it was managed, which were the actions taken, and of course, to assess the efficacy of these actions. It's also very important to have strategic objectives very well established, and of course, indicators. The only way to know how we are performing is to measure, right? So same situation is for our authorities. They need to really know where they are going, what they want to cover, which are the objectives, and how the evolution of these objectives is being assessed periodically. As it was already mentioned and it was already described, the use of WHO's global benchmarking tool is very important, as we already saw. This tool is really assessing the maturity level of authorities, and this is very much linked to the systems in place, to how efficient the authority is. So we really encourage authorities to use the principles of this global benchmarking tool, and as Cami already described, this is a very important topic that could take a whole webinar, but it's very important to cover. The publication of annual reports is also important. We all know that whenever we have follow-up actions, follow-up meetings, we are forced to really look at our actions, to really analyze if we are doing well, if more actions are necessary. And besides this, besides following up with the actions that we are committed, it's important to be transparent. We know this is one of the principles of good regulatory practices, so this has to be clearly published. Of course, an important item that we have included is the development of business continuity and crisis management plans. Where is this coming from? Well, this is coming from many experiences that we have had a long time. We know that we can all face natural disasters, we can face cyber attacks. The pandemic was a real life example that also affected our regulatory agencies. We were all in a shutdown situation, and some of the agencies were not able to continue with their operations. It took some time for them to really establish how to keep working. We have faced examples like the cyber attacks in which the authorities really shut down for a period, and it's impossible to continue with operations. We as regulated industry, we are not able to submit, we are not able to get responses, and the authority is not able to continue the work. So that's why we think this is an important piece from good regulatory practices and an important action for implementing good regulatory practices. On the next slide, we can see other actions that we recommend. And definitely having a regulatory agenda helps all of us. This gives clarity. It's important to know which are the priorities for the authority, when they are covering these priorities, and how, who are the stakeholders, what we can expect. So this is important for all of us, because also for the industry, it's important to know where we can collaborate with our authorities. A topic that was already mentioned is very important, the convergence with international guidelines and standards. And why is this important? Well, this is important because nowadays we are all looking for effectiveness, for efficacy, for being very, very effective in general. And convergence helps we all to really achieve our results. We are in a global world. Now the world is becoming smaller because we are all together. So there's no necessity to have different concepts or different criteria for the same situation. Convergence is really something very valuable for all regulatory systems. And this has to be done with guidelines and also with standards. Another item that was already mentioned and very well covered by our colleagues from FDA, and there was a very nice question about this, is a commenting period. It was described by FDA that they can have different times that can go from 30 days to 120 days, and in some cases could be more than that if necessary. But an average of 60 days is highly recommended, because it is important that all stakeholders involved in a new regulation or in a regulation that is being revised, that really have the time to comment, to ask questions, and to provide input. So 60-day period is something that we think is acceptable, and this is important for public consultations. Of course, another important action is to publish the status of regulations under review. It's important to know where we are, if comments have been received, if comments are being assessed, are analyzed, by when we can expect a final version of the new regulation. So it's very important for all of us to really be able to follow up, and mainly if we have some changes to the regulation that really can have an important impact to the regulated industry, it's important to know how to be prepared and how to be really fully compliant with the new regulation. And of course, another key aspect of this is the implementation plans for newly adopted regulations, which is very much related to the publication of the status of these regulations under review. It's important to know how this new regulation will be adopted. And now that we have that we are looking for a harmonized world, and that we are every day working more on harmonization as well, it's important to know what international instances are doing and what the main regulators are doing. So it's important to know which are the plans, when we will see those regulations implemented. On next slide, please. We can also provide some practical recommendations for regulatory submissions. And I like very much this because, good regulatory practices is not a commitment only from the authorities. It's also a commitment for the regulated industry. And it's important, for example, to know which are the times that the regulatory authorities have established for the assessment of our submissions. Those need to be very clear timelines and feasible, of course. Sometimes there's very few time for providing some information, some answers, and it's important to be realistic. And also, of course, we expect that the assessments take a feasible time, that they don't take too long, because as we all have discussed, science is evolving very quickly. And sometimes we have seen assessments that take really too long. And by the time that is approved, maybe the science already evolved, and now the situation that we were reporting has already changed. So it's important to really respect these timelines, to have appropriate timelines for Q&A, and of course, a very well-known time for a final decision. Another very valuable aspect that we found from the good regulatory practices is pre-submission meetings. Communication between authorities and the regulated industry is clear, is very important. It's key for having efficient regulatory systems. So it's important to establish the possibility of having these meetings because there has to be more clarity about the product that is being submitted, about any questions that we might have, and also the use of digital platforms to enable the tracking of regulatory submissions. The world is becoming very much digital, and of course, authorities are not really far from that. So it's important to have appropriate systems to track where we are with regulatory systems and to really be able to know when we are having questions, by when we can expect to provide answers, when those are assessed, and so. Another action is the use of regulatory reliance strategies. Reliance is also a very important pilot for strong regulatory systems. So it's important to use those along the whole life cycle management of products, not just for submissions of new chemical entities or new products. It's important to use that because those agencies that use reliance are more efficient. They have a more efficient work to use their resources. And something that we value very much is the publication of assessment reports. Why? Well, because assessment reports are used by other agencies when we submit our applications to other agencies, as it is the case of Latin America, for example. Those reports are very useful for our regulatory authorities to know how the product was assessed or was evaluated by a reference authority. So this is something that is very valuable for us. Next slide, please. Well, and FIFARMA wants to recognize something that is very important and that we all saw during the pandemic, the value of good regulatory practices in public health emergencies. The pandemic gave us a very good example about how good regulatory practices can be implemented and how valuable they are. So we already discussed that one of the characteristics of good regulatory practices is that they should be flexible rather than prescriptive. And this is something that we could see when we were facing really unforeseen circumstances and the authorities were obliged to act very quickly to approve, for example, in the case of vaccines, they were really new and we didn't have the time to start discussing a new regulation for those vaccines, to have long discussions about how to assess them and who will approve first. No, we really had to be very quickly. And here we could see a very nice example of how flexibility is a very valuable principle of good regulatory practices. We could see timely responses to an urgent situation. Next slide, please. On this slide, we can see very nice examples, and Cami was already sharing that we could see some practical examples of the value of these principles from good regulatory practices. The Pan American Health Organization prepared a very nice summary about the main measures that were implemented during the pandemic. And these are some experiences that we had about the appropriate use of good regulatory practices and how they really support a very good response. So for example, talking about proportionality, well, this was already discussed. The regulation, of course, has to be very tough because we are talking about life of patients, but it's important to have a good balance, a good risk-benefit balance. So that's why it's important that the regulations are proportional. In the case of the pandemic, we were under an urgent situation. So it was important to be very tough on the assessment of these vaccines, for example, or other health technologies. It was important to be proportional in order to provide a good response as quick as possible. As we already discussed, it was important for regulators to also be flexible, or for regulations to be flexible, because this helped us to be able to respond to these changes in the regulated environment. We know that during the development of vaccines, we had many changes on the dossiers, many changes in the manufacturing sites. So everything was evolving so quickly. Every day we had new information. And that's why the flexibility of regulations could really support high quality decisions in a very short time. Clarity. It was important to have clarity on which were the regulations that were being used, which were the basis and which was the rationale for taking regulatory decisions. It was important that this was available for all the involved parties. And of course, the efficiency. Resources are always limited. We have agencies with very limited resources in our region. And we know that the pandemic affected this even more because we also had personnel from the regulatory agencies who were affected by COVID. Their families were affected. So we saw a limitation in resources. Also, there was an emergency, but it was important to also take care of other issues that were already present at the agencies. So that's why tools that bring efficiencies to regulatory systems were very used, like reliance, like work sharing models that we see, alignment to international requirements, and also, of course, transparency. We saw very nice examples of great communication between the regulators and the regulated industry. And this information sharing among all stakeholders really helped a lot to speed up the approvals and availability of health technologies for tackling the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide, please. So, well, as you have seen, FIFARMA is really committed to increase regulatory efficiency. And we recognize how important it is for the regulated industry and, of course, for our authorities to support implementation of good regulatory practices and to really create a culture that allows our authorities to advance. That's why FIFARMA is really committed, and we really take the opportunity of this webinar to reinforce our commitment to continue to work ethically and to promote trust of regulators in our practices. And on the next slide, we can show some of the practices that we are really committed to apply. The first one is a responsible sharing of clinical trial data. And what is very important, you can say, oh, you are going to share this. Yes, but in a manner that ensures safeguarding the privacy of patients and also of the investigators and all trial participants. We are also committed to routinely collaborate with researchers and to provide public access to clinical trial results. We also support national regulatory authorities by providing capacity building with, trainings, webinar information, all what our authorities require to really strengthen the regulatory systems, all information that comes from internationally recognized standards and guidelines. We also want to collaborate with regulators in anticipating trends by bringing information related to new technologies and best practices implemented in the regulated sector. And also our fifth commitment is to provide timely information to and collaborating with regulators on safety and quality issues globally to enable fast regulatory response decisions. So with this, I would like to give you some final messages. On the next slide, please. This is like a summary from FIFARMA. And well, one of our key messages is that adoption of good regulatory practices by regulators in Latin America and the Caribbean is fundamental to strengthen regulatory systems, to achieve efficiencies and to enable regional and international cooperation among agencies and support improved public health outcomes is really an objective from FIFARMA. And also, of course, something that we recommend is that all stakeholders involved in the health systems, that include, of course, the regulators, the industry, the academia, we all should continue with our efforts to fully incorporate principles of good regulatory practices for the ultimate benefit of our patients. And on the next slide, you will find, the links to the English version and the Spanish version of FIFARMA's position paper on good regulatory practices. On behalf of FIFARMA, I really want to thank you to the organizers of this webinar and to all of those who are attending, taking the time to attend this. Thank you for your attention, and we are ready to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for a couple of questions. I'd like to invite Camila and Maria here on video. So there's a question, is there a plan of convergence of the Latin America regulations, and what countries are part of FIFARMA?
I can take this question. Thanks a lot. Well, FIFARMA is not comprised of governments, but of industry companies and industry associations. And I would say that we cover the whole region with some exceptions. I would have to maybe refer this part of the question to my FIFARMA colleagues, because I might not take it correctly. And the first part of the questions, I would say that regulatory convergence and harmonization of requirements, it is something that all regulators are looking to, or if they're not, they should be, right? We have different initiatives, and this can be a very broad answer, but maybe here I will focus will be in there are guidelines and references that are recognized as references for the regulatory activities of regulators. If we talk about the pharmaceutical sector, for instance, there are the guidelines from the International Council of Harmonization, ICH. We do have, of course, the references, technical references from the WHO, the World Health Organization. We also count with, for instance, references in the area of good manufacturing practices coming from the Pharmaceutical Inspections Cooperation Schemes, or PICS. So there are a series of references, and those references in the WHO recommendations is what they say regulators should be looking at when developing their regulations. So it doesn't matter if it is a regional initiative or building a local regulation, or even building harmonization of processes and requirements across regions. Ideally, and the recommendation is that regulators and industry look to those international standards whenever possible in order for them to converge. I hope this answers the question. There are a series of regional alliances, formal and informal, that promote regulatory convergence. Maybe I can say for the Americas in general, we have coordinated by the Pan American Health Organization. We have the PANDRA network, the Pan American Network for Harmonization. But I would say for the whole region, I think that this is the only thing that exists. And then you have other initiatives that try to promote convergence to those international references and guidelines in different settings.
Thank you very much for that. May I invite Patty to perhaps read the next question?
Yeah, the next question is more a comment, and I see that Camila is typing an answer to the comment.
Okay. Okay, great. We'll take maybe take a look at Camila's answer on the written response. I'll have you write the response, Camila. And I see a comment here. I know that we're running out of time, but I do see a couple comments here regarding whether presentations and recordings are going to be available. And the answer is yes. And we had Diego from FIFARMA comment earlier that they will be available on the website, and we'll be sure to share the information with the attendees after the webinar. But we do have presentations as well as recording of this webinar that will be made available. Question is, considering, I'll read this last question, and then we'll move on, because I think we're running out of time here. Considering the diversity in regulation across international, are the GRP promoting or making recommendations for harmonization between countries? I think you might have already commented on this, Camila, but if you want to further clarify, or Maria.
Tony, do you want to add something?
Oh, yes. Well, yes, I think this was already covered, but what I can tell is that, yes, there's many efforts in promoting the implementation of good regulatory practices along the region. So, of course, this is very much linked to recommendations for harmonization, because as we have already discussed, we are looking for efficient regulatory systems. So, of course, it's not so easy, but of course, as it was already described, WHO issued in 2021 this document that states the importance of applying good regulatory practices and good reliance practices. And this is part of the efforts from WHO for strengthening regulatory systems, which of course includes high recommendations for harmonization and the use of reliance. So everything is linked. If you go to those reports, you can see that there's this high, yes, these comments or this high recommendation to use all of these items that are exactly or perfectly linked. I don't know if I was clear, but yes, summarizing, the answer is yes, of course. Good regulatory practices is an essential pilot for promoting harmonization between countries.
I think you were very clear. Thank you very much for those clarifications. I think at this point, I would like to move on to the next topic on the agenda. As I mentioned to the speakers before, if you do have the time, I think I see there's a couple more questions in the chat. And if you take the time to answer those in writing, that would, I'm sure the participants would really much appreciate it. Thank you so much. At this point, for the next topic, we have Natalia Costa that will be presenting on good regulatory practices implementation for ANVISA's RDC 741. Welcome, Natalia. Natalia is the administrative assistant of ANVISA since 2018, and she has worked at the Medicines Market Regulation Chamber, and since 2021, she has been part of the International Affairs Office at ANVISA and is in charge of the administration project and control substances. I see that you already shared the screen. Please feel free to take it over. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Visa, for the presentation. Can you see my screen? I don't hear you, so I'll start.
Yes, please go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you. Good morning to you all. Unfortunately, Leonardo, the head of ANVISA's International Affairs Office, couldn't participate in this meeting, but I hope to contribute with an overview of the implementation of good regulatory practices in ANVISA, especially regarding the recent Collegiate Board Resolution number 741 from last year that dealt with regulatory reliance. I speak from ANVISA's International Affairs Office, which follows all sorts of international topics, and we were responsible for drafting this resolution that provides for the general criteria for reliance. So it deals with the subject from a broader perspective related to ANVISA's international strategy and paves the way for other more specific norms with the peculiarities of the different regulatory processes and regulated products. These specific norms are being drafted and tested by the technical areas of the agency. So my talk will focus on the general norm, RDC 741, which was perhaps the first written framework that endorsed and gathered reliance initiatives that were already being held and implemented by the agency in the last years. So the trust building process to reach this point involves all the international discussions in which ANVISA have participated since the creation of the agency. We could start a quick historical summary in 2010, when ANVISA was recognized by the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, as the national regulatory authority of regional reference. Today, we exchange inspection reports for medicines and medical devices with other NRAs and with Mercosur authorities. In 2012, we were co-founders of the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities. This allowed us to establish high-level dialogues with the leaders of the main international regulatory authorities. And since this March, our director-president assumed one of the vice chairs of the coalition. Since 2015, the control of APIs produced here is recognized by the European Union as equivalent, so it benefits from simplified procedures for exports. And we have been an ICH member since 2016, and we put a lot of effort into adapting to all of its guides on quality, safety, efficacy, multidisciplinary matters, and standardization of processes. As a member of ICH Management Committee, ANVISA participates in the decision-making process, which favors greater alignment of the Brazilian legislation with the best international practices, bringing more security to society and competitiveness to the national market. Since 2021, we are a PICS member, and we have international recognition of the excellence of medicines and API inspections. And we are also in the Orbis project, which has already resulted in 19 drug registrations granted by ANVISA, and about 14 products are currently under evaluation. And we also participate in the medical device single audit program and use its reports to grant certification of good manufacturing practices. In addition to all this, in the last year, we have signed cooperation agreements and partnerships for the sharing of confidential information, exchange of experiences and knowledge, training, and joint work, which allows us the deepening of trust with international partners. For this year and the next year, our main international goal is the recognition of the Brazilian regulatory system as of excellence by the WHO through the global benchmarking tool, as Camila explained, so that Brazil can be listed as a reference regulatory authority, and we're preparing for that. As we could see, ANVISA was already using several collaborative and reliance practices, but didn't have an internal set of clear and harmonized principles for their organization. So last year, we approved RDC 741 to consolidate in a general and cohesive framework some guidelines for this use. The motivation for this resolution was the perception of the fast advance of new technologies, the highly complex regulatory novelties, and the limited availability of resources. This combination poses a challenge to a timely and effective regulatory action throughout all the product's life cycle. Discussions on collaborative practices are gaining prominence and international maturity. So the adoption of reliance mechanisms was perceived as an efficient strategy to face this dynamic scenario with a more efficient use of the resources, increasing the quality of regulatory decisions, reducing duplication of effort, and allowing regulators to focus their work on key activities. And in the big picture, promoting timely access to safe, effective, and quality products. we found that an internal regulation on the use of reliance practices by the agency could improve the use of all the benefits of the tool, such as having access to reports and opinions from other authorities, enhance the exchange of information, cooperation, reciprocity. And it would legitimize the practice in the agency, give transparency, and could serve as a reference for regulatory authorities in countries that buy medicines produced nationally. This resolution was conceived to guide the use of analysis carried out by equivalent foreign regulatory authority by ANVISA, serving as a basis for subsequent regulation. So it does not define deadlines. It does not define the level of detail of documentation or which authorities are trusted, but it defines concepts and paves the way for other more specific regulatory acts that defines the necessary steps and workflows for each case by process or by product category. This concept of equivalent foreign regulatory authority, for example, is defined in Article 2 as the foreign regulatory authority or international organization with regulatory practices aligned with ANVISA's. The foreign authority is responsible for ensuring that the products authorized for distribution were appropriately assessed and that they meet recognized standards of quality, safety, and efficacy, which shall be considered by ANVISA in a practice of regulatory reliance. So the model presents two types of category of criteria for the adoption of reliance practices. The general criteria to confirm that there's sufficient similarity between the foreign authority and ANVISA to support this collaborative work, and the criteria for verifying the admissibility of an analysis report. The identification of an authority to be considered can take into account objective criteria, for example, belonging to a WHO classification or to a convergence forum, or it can take into account subjective criteria, considering, for example, the history of the relationship and the trust between the authorities. The specific criteria for the admissibility of an analysis is defined in the specific regulations, but the resolution states that the foreign authority must have a transparent management system guided by good regulatory practices. The resolution also brings the definition of optimized analysis procedure as the technical assessment mechanism facilitated by regulatory reliance practices, which uses technical analysis or application documents issued by an equivalent authority as sole or complementary reference. It also defines work sharing and recognition. The latter understood as the practice in which the decision made by another authority is automatically adopted by ANVISA, and work sharing as the reliance practice in which two or more regulatory authorities share their activities to carry out a specific regulatory task. This practice has been widely used for inspections, for example, optimizing the use of resources and reducing the time for granting the certification of good manufacturing practices. Work sharing may also involve the joint assessment of health surveillance processes and the exchange of information between authorities in order to share their analysis, benefit from each other's knowledge, and discuss any deficiencies of the data assessed. A collaborative practice that showed many results during the COVID-19 pandemic, and that can be very useful for innovative and highly complex products. The resolution established that the analysis carried out by an equivalent foreign regulator can be admitted for an optimized analysis procedure, which can be facilitated through reliance practices such as work sharing or mutual or bilateral recognition. For this optimized analysis, the application documents should first confirm that the product assessed by the foreign authority is essentially identical to the one submitted to ANVISA. It should also have been elaborated using standards consistent with the ones used by ANVISA in order to ensure that it has the same scope. And the documentation should be presented in its complete form, including the questions made and any guidance during the analysis by the equivalent authority, except if exempted in specific regulations. When there is a difference between the parameters of the health surveillance process or the corresponding product assessed in the application documents from the equivalent authority and our parameters, such difference must be justified by the applicant, and the same level of health protection must be ensured. It is important to say that ANVISA continues with its autonomy and actually carries out an evaluation with the necessary level of detail and confirms it, but in an optimized way and with more subsidies and comments from partner agencies. The admissibility for the foreign analysis shall be confirmed through a decision of our board, taking into account the technical analysis from our offices and the accordance with the specific regulations. And it is continuously monitored and assessed and can be revoked if the conditions are not maintained. It is important to highlight that the resolution emphasizes the agency's autonomy during the process, especially in the final decision of the claim. The resolution, as a general framework, defines that the optimized analysis procedure should also meet the provisions established in specific regulations. So the idea of this norm was to be this great umbrella from which products and processes could be then regulated accordingly to the reality and interest of each specific segment. Today, this resolution has some outcomes. For medicines registration, there's RDC 750, which establishes a temporary optimized analysis procedure for medicines and biological products. And there's the public consultation 1108, which proposes modalities and criteria for optimized analysis procedure, in which evaluations conducted by equivalent authority are used to support assessment for registration and post-registration of drugs and biological products, and letter of adequacy of active pharmaceutical ingredients. Another outcome of this resolution is regards inspection. It's the public consultation number 1135, which proposes specific criteria and procedures for defining the equivalent foreign authorities of the inspection process of manufacturers of APIs, cannabis product for medicinal purposes, medicines and biological products, and also proposes the optimized good manufacturing practices certification review process. We are also discussing reliance for medical devices and defensive chemicals. In the specific case of medicines, ANVISA has been working both on the registration front and on the inspection of good practices front. In the case of registration, we want a reliance process in which ANVISA defines which authorities are we going to rely on, and we want to keep with the last word on the entrance of the product in the Brazilian market. But we want to take into account the foreign decision and to really understand the rationale behind it. And for that, we need access to the complete documentation. We understand that reliance practices can serve in different ways for all regulatory authorities. For us, as a trusting authority in our day-to-day activities, reliance means to strengthen our regulatory capacity. It means to provide a faster analysis, a more strategic use of the resources, and in the end, to deliver a more efficient service for society, guaranteeing timely access and availability of products with quality, safety, and efficacy. On the flip side, as a trusted authority, we've been working to minimize barriers, such as the lack of regulatory framework, confidentiality challenges, and building trust by participating in convergence forums, adapting to the best international practices, and preparing for the WHO assessment through the global benchmarking tool, and hope to be recognized with a high maturity level. Finally, this resolution 741 served as a basis for the specific areas of the agency to define specific rules and procedures adapted to their products and regulatory processes. The resolution created guidelines and brought concepts to harmonize regulatory reliance initiatives, as well as restated some principles such as the autonomy of the agency and of the decisions, the transparency, and the consistency of practices and outcomes. Please feel free to make any comments, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. I think we have a couple questions. It states, I consider that it's hard work for implementation of GRPs in LATAM, and so what obstacles do you deal with this, and how do you solve them? Maybe you can comment if you particular to the RDC 741 and the implementation of that, if there's been any obstacles, and how you went about solving them.
Yes, some of the obstacles was due to the lack of regulatory framework and the consciousness of the importance of reliance, not only by the industry, but also by the agents of ANVISA themselves. So we had to work to improve the knowledge on what is reliance, and to explain that it doesn't mean a lack of autonomy, and that it could serve as a good weapon a good tool to the optimization of the use of resources.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Patty, do you mind reading the next question?
Absolutely. So what are the more relevant technical barriers and how they can be mitigated regarding the harmonization amongst countries?
Regarding technical barriers, we could see with the RDC 750, which regulates medicines registration, that the market's adherence, for example, seems to be lower than expected in this first moment. So we are trying to establish dialogues with the industry to understand why and to collect suggestions and inputs. But we believe that much of this is because it's a new tool, and that still does not have many successful examples to generate robust examples and performance statistics. Maybe some adaptation time will be necessary, and we are willing to adopt measures and safeguards for this adaptation, but we believe it's an unavoidable process.
Thank you. The next question says, which regulatory authorities provide applicants with full unedited assessment reports? And I'm sure ANVISA cannot comment for other regulatory authorities, but perhaps from ANVISA's perspective, you can comment on that. And how do you carry out the abbreviated evaluation and verification route? What is the number of marketing authorizations that ANVISA has granted using the abbreviated evaluation and verification routes?
I think the first question was which regulatories are we going to trust? Regulatory authorities are we going to trust?
Well, the
what-
question says which regulatory authorities provide applicants with full unedited assessment report. So, perhaps it's asking about the reports that you will be seeing and whether that's unedited reports from other regulatory authorities going to the applicants. And what is the verification route for this type of review, which it's indicated as abbreviated evaluation.
Okay, so the adoption of ICH guides and the adherence to the PICs, for example, were challenging process for ANVISA and of great growth of the agency. And it demanded a significant investment in terms of qualification of employees and participation in meetings. This was a necessary effort because we want to not only to follow, but to participate and have a voice in the conception of international regulations. So we are looking for authorities, this concept of equivalent authorities. We are looking for authorities that maintain a similar commitment to adapting to good regulatory practices. But the list itself of the trusted authorities can consider objective aspects such as recognition of reference authority by WHO, or more subjective aspects related to the history of cooperative partnerships and trust. And the authorities will be listed in the specific regulations by product or by regulatory process in a specific legislation. It's not in this general rule.
Okay, and I guess you would not be expecting for the applicants to submit a whole unedited version from another regulator that has already reviewed and approved the product, right? I think that's also one of the question.
Sorry, can you repeat, please?
So I think the question also indicates if you would be looking at or expecting an unedited assessment report that another regulator has already reviewed as part of this process.
Yes, we're hoping to get the complete documentation, including all the questions and the guidances that the equivalent agency used for the evaluation.
The next question is, does ANVISA have the mutual recognition procedure in the case of products approved by a reference authority?
Mutual recognition is in this general criteria is an option, but we are still defining specific criteria for it in each by each product or process.
Okay. And for which product does ANVISA apply the verified analysis? There's that question.
So we are starting with medicines. We have already a temporary resolution on that. We also have a public consultation for inspections of good manufacturing practices. And we are discussing medical devices and chemical defensives.
Thank you. How was the development process of the piece of for this piece of regulation, and what were the activities the agency had to make regarding changing mindsets within the agency?
This resolution was the result of a public consultation we made in 2021. We gathered more than 300 comments and suggestions. We have grouped them by article. We adopted some of them and rejected others to reach these texts.
Great, thank you. And It also, oops, I think maybe Camila answered that question. Do you develop specific procedure that must be followed by the people that review the dossiers?
Yes, but it depends on the product and the regulatory processes. It's still in a premature discussion by the technical areas of the agency.
Thank you. Do you have an example under this optimized analysis, and how does this benefit the process?
As an international affairs office, I don't have a technical example, but it benefits the process because it's faster, definitely faster. And when we can manage, optimize the management of the resources, so we can focus in key activities instead of having to regulate all of the aspects in the product's life cycle and not do it so well. So we think the final decision is improved, and it's the access to the product is timely access to the product.
Thank you. And the other question is, what are the main criteria that ANVISA considers to determine the sameness of the products?
We only accept if the product is the same of the one assessed by the equivalent agency. The specific criteria to define what will be considered the sameness will depend on the product and will depend on the regulatory process. So, but in general, the industry should prove that the product is the same.
Thank you. The other question is, are then the recognized authorities selected by cooperation mechanisms as picks, or are they evaluated individually?
For medicines registration, they will be evaluated individually. We want to have the last word on the entrance of the product in the market. And we also want to have the control of the process. So the board of the directors can, if the criteria is not maintained by the equivalent authority, the board can revoke and at any time. So we want to keep with an autonomy and to choose in which authorities are we going to trust.
Thank you so much, Natalia. And may I invite Patty? I think there might be a couple questions left. So we'll give an opportunity for those questions.
Sure. So the first one is, what are the benefits that you have received when incorporating the reliance in your internal processes?
We're still in the beginning of the incorporation of reliance, so we don't have enough data yet to make a robust statistics on it. But we could say that the time for the approvals are going to be is going to be faster. And we expect to best improve the human and the resources of the agency.
Okay, thank you. There's another question that about the climate zones, and they are asking how do you handle the differences or the different conditions for different climate zones in Brazil versus the ones that are presented to the recognized authority for stability purposes, I guess.
Yes, this is not in the general resolution, this broader resolution, but it can be specified in the for specific products, and it depends on the product and on the regulatory process.
Thank you. And the other one, I guess, is not specifically for ANVISA, but I guess that you can comment on it since it's the process. But they are asking as a regulated person or company, how they can request regulatory agents of reference the analysis that it conducted in order to register or approve a product.
Usually the equivalent authorities exchange information by themselves, but I think each regulatory authority should respond to that question and have a different procedure for granting the information.
Thank you. So I guess those are all the, there's another one in English you wanna go through?
Yeah,
it,
sure.
Lisa? Okay.
One more. What is the number of marketing authorizations that ANVISA has granted using the abbreviated evaluation and verification routes?
I don't have this number now, but I can, in some minutes, maybe answer this person in particular.
Sure.
Yeah.
You can just put the answer in the box.
Yeah.
No problem. I think that's all the questions that we have. I would like to just maybe take the opportunity to indicate maybe in a summary, what we all have discussed in this particular webinar. I think overall I think there was a messaging that overall regulatory processes have to ensure that regulations are well designed, transparent, effective, and responsive to the needs. This way, they aim to strike a balance between protecting the public health and fostering innovation and growth while involving stakeholders such as industry, consumer groups, and other organizations in the decision-making process. And I would comment just for I think for FDA, GRPs are a priority, particularly our Office of Global Policy and Strategy. That's a priority, and they do so by promoting these GRPs in international negotiations. And through our FDA Latin America office, we do a lot of other activities such as technical exchanges with regulators that emphasize the importance of international harmonization and international standards, along with transparency, but also work with other offices at FDA that work on trade agreements and discussions on the margins of those agreements. We also collaborate very closely, like I mentioned, with the regulators in the region. We try to create private-public partnerships to help advance the work in this area. One of the good examples is organizing this particular webinar. I mean, I would like to take the opportunity to also thank FIFARMA as well as ANVISA for participating today and all the other FDA colleagues that presented today to be able to provide this information to our participants. I just, again, thank you everyone for participating. There's been some really great questions that people have on the chat that allowed us to have this discussion. The other thing I would mention is I think it's really important for us to receive feedback. You can send those feedback through our FDA Latin America office. We're looking for ways to hear also from all of you to see how we can collectively advance this work on GRPs here in the region. So we're looking to hear from you, and hopefully you take the time to do so. With that, I think I will end it, but I would like to invite also anyone from FIFARMA if you have any last-minute words before we conclude the webinar. I see Camila. Go ahead.
Thank you, Vesa. Thank you for this opportunity of adding to your comments in this closing part of the session. It has been an honor for us to collaborate with the FDA and also with ANVISA to bring these information. I think that this is a conversation starter, right? Hopefully we will have the opportunity to dig deeper into a lot of the topics that were briefly covered in today's webinar in the future. To complement what Natalia was saying, ANVISA published this umbrella regulation about reliance, and we are looking forward to further discuss the specific instruments for reliance that ANVISA is going to publish in the near future. And it was mentioned, there's a lot going on in Brazil, and we as FIFARMA, we have been observing that. And we believe that some of those practices that not only Brazil, but other countries in the region implement can and should be shared with different stakeholders in the region. And only this sharing of information and enabling others outside our barriers or outside our frontiers to understand and learn from the practical experience of regulators will be what will definitely support the advancement of good regulatory practices in the region. If you allow me, I would like to briefly refer. I answered via the chat, but there was a question from Blanca that how can we break the barriers that exist between regulatory authorities in the Americas, considering the level of qualification of PAHO? I put the long answer in the chat, but I would like to answer with a short answer, which is together. So together, industry, regulators, all the stakeholders, we should be constantly reviewing our practices. We should be in constant dialogue, because this is the way that we can break the barriers and enable all regulators in the region to operate at the level that the local populations deserve, which is according to the WHO measurements, a maturity level 3 under the global benchmarking tool as a minimum. So yeah, let's do that, and let's do that together.
Thank you. That's a really nice message at the end. With that, I think we can wrap this up. Again, just thank you everyone for joining, and hopefully we can organize something else like this in the near future. Thanks everyone.